Everyone, and welcome to our last winter 2016 lecture. My name is Leila Marikara, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Architectural Science. Tonight is the 2015-2016 Marjorie Winkler Memorial Lecture. Professor Marjorie Winkler was an inspiring academic and educator. She specialized in landscape architecture, design, and management, green rooftops, healthy school grounds and healthy gardens, as well as community outreach programming. Through this endowed lecture, colleagues, peers, family members, former students, and the community come together to remember her and her legacy. I would now like to introduce tonight's speaker, Susannah Drake. Susannah is the founding principal of DLand Studio. As one of the very few designers of her generation with professional design qualifications in architecture and landscape architecture, Susannah paved the way for more synthetic thinking about urban ecological infrastructure and was recently described as one of New York's most promising emerging designers by NewYork.com. The New York Center for Architecture awarded DLand Studio its 2014 New Practices New York Award. In 2013, she was awarded the National AIA Young Architects Award, fellowship in the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the firm was recognized as a New York Architectural League Emerging Voice. In 2015, she was part of the resource team for the Mayor's Institute on City Design, and she's currently the Urban Design Fellow for the Design Trust for Public Space under the Elevated Project, and a member of the United States Department of State Bureau of Overseas Building Operations Advisory Group. With grants from foundations and public agencies, DLand Studio redesigns underutilized infrastructure corridors for stormwater capture, climate resilience, and park development. The firm work has been exhibited widely and is in the permanent exhibitions or collections of the MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the National Design Museum, amongst others. In parallel to her practice, Susannah has taught at Harvard, Syracuse, Washington University in St. Louis, City College of New York, the Cooper Union, and was the CJAS Scholar at Florida International University in 2014. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Susannah Drake.
Well, thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to hear that I'm the final winter lecture, because it must mean spring is coming, right? We can hope. I'm originally from Vermont, so I'm used to cold weather, and I'm teaching this semester at IIT, so there's a little bit less snow there, but it's pretty similar climate-wise. So my lecture tonight is called The Creation of 21st Century Public Infrastructure, Beauty, Economics, Politics, and Ecology. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how the American political system shaped the landscape of the United States and how that has affected my work. But first, just to talk about my firm a little bit, you know, I think it's a big claim to say that you know, I'm a sort of leader in terms of interdisciplinary practice, but I have to say when I got out of school with a degree in architecture and a degree in landscape architecture, most of the firms didn't know what to do with me. It was really unpopular, and it was hard for me to get a job in spite of having 3 Ivy League degrees. So, you know, I kind of invented my own way, and in forming my practice 10 years ago, I feel like we developed, again, a kind of new paradigm. We make it up and we make it happen. We kind of look for issues that are facing a lot of cities and then try to come up with solutions or ideas that can affect the community, that look at water systems, infrastructure, economy, climate, and ecology, kind of bring all of these things together through a very holistic and collaborative design process. I have currently about 10 people, and I'm going to grow the firm probably to about 20 in the next 5 years. So to start on this sort of political diatribe, as it were, I want to reference Thomas Jefferson and the sale of land to actually run the United States. The United States didn't have a system of taxation at that time, and so what he did was he actually sold off the American landscape and created the land ordinance grid as an economic generator for the country, and that led to the patterns that you see when you're up in the air flying across the country. These grids that really had very little to do with geography. 100 years later, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, and what was important as a differentiator between Jefferson and Lincoln is that Jefferson enabled people who had the money, and they tended to be white men, to buy land. Actually, they kind of had to be white men. And Lincoln opened up the sale of smaller properties with systems of credit to people who were the heads of household. So the heads of household could be people of color, they could be women, and it really sort of changed the shape of this grid. And you started to see a different kind of pattern developing within the larger systems. But I want you to just take note of this, that it's kind of this grid that's slapped down without really recognition of geography, like this river running through it, but that geography wants to push back against the political system. So in 1934, FDR signed or created the New Deal and invested $20 billion into the US government, or into creating new buildings and infrastructure and parks and parkways throughout the country with his Works Progress administration. These civic buildings are all across the country and really represented an ideal about design in America, and also put a lot of people to work. They also brought power, jobs, and flood control to a lot of rural communities with the Tennessee Valley Authority. So there was this government creation of infrastructure that was an economic generator. And it created massive ecological change, and these are the kinds of things I've been looking at since I was a student back at the GSD. I got a grant to study dams in the American Southwest, and so I went out and looked at sort of the patterns that exist in the landscape in relation to the massive impoundment of water. And this was something that sort of came from my childhood as well, because my father was a geophysicist, so I've always had a fascination with kind of the geology and the shape of human intervention on the sort of larger scale landscape. But infrastructure, which is kind of my muse as a term, developed in the World War II era in reference to military logistical operations. And General Eisenhower, after the war, created the federal highway system with a $25 billion investment in our national infrastructure. So he called it the Federal Highway Defense System, and this is really important because it was a political issue. You had a country that was really wounded by war, and he created this idea for connectivity that was pervasive, and it was cast as a way to make sure that every area of the country was safe because it was connected, but it also led to massive economic development in terms of the post-war suburb that we know today. And unfortunately, there are people in government who still believe that the building of these kinds of highways is about economic development.
The problem is, though, when our infrastructure is not being destroyed by robots and or saved by Bruce Willis, we tend to find it a bit boring.
As you know, infrastructure is not a sexy or a glamorous topic.
As much as I like to think otherwise, infrastructure is not sexy.
Infrastructure is not very sexy.
Yes, infrastructure, like those men we just heard from, is not sexy.
So I apologize for blowing the timing on that. Jokes are all about timing, but it's true that infrastructure is thought of as something that's that's sort of perfunctory. It's necessary, and it's not necessarily about beauty. But if we look back to 1965, on August 22nd, the Highway Beautification Act was signed by LBJ, and there were huge protests about this. because what she tried to do, or what he tried to do with his wife, Lady Bird, was to transform these highways that were created as kind of these machines for moving people and turn them into something that was actually more beautiful, that was actually civic, that was about sort of a national pride in this infrastructure. So what I'm trying to do is actually think about how we might be really bringing out this idea now in the 21st century. And the next video I'm going to show is for a competition we did for Montreal. And it was connecting the airport with downtown. So here I'm sort of expanding our world to North America, being a little more inclusive. Things you may have noticed in that video is that the infrastructure actually takes up a huge amount of space in the city, and it's an incredible opportunity for us to think about how these systems can be actually integrated with the urban design. So a lot of the work that I do relates to the intersection between roads and watersheds. When the highway system was developed in the US at least, it wasn't really planned for going into cities. And so it actually took an extra 10 years to build. And so a lot of the work that we're doing now is trying to sort of reconcile the issues that have been created by this, and water is one of the critical issues. So we've been working on a lot of different strategies, working with government agencies to develop new prototypes and thinking about watersheds throughout New York City, but also thinking about how these systems are compromised by climate change. I'm actually from Vermont, and this is what happened after Irene. So I think that, since Irene and since Sandy and since Katrina, there's been much more of a new awareness of urban hydrology. And that also is the case in the United States because of the signing of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act in the early 70s. Nixon signed these laws and also created the Environmental Protection Agency, which is now actually putting pressure on city governments to clean up their water systems, their sewage systems, and their freshwater drinking systems, and their stormwater systems. And so on the local level, you get a lot of mayors that are now getting a lot of pressure from the federal government to make change. And we're fortunate to have a really brilliant mayor who was a great sort of organizer and created this thing called Plan YC, a Greater Greener New York, which had a set of metrics for how to improve the city. And some of those metrics related to improving the environment, adding green space, making the city more livable. But across the United States, there are 772 cities that have combined sewer systems. And Thomas Crapper did not invent the flush toilet, but he popularized it. And because of his work, the combined sewer system was invented. And what it is it's a system that helps to, or basically it brings together sanitary sewers and stormwater sewage with an overflow system. So you can see in this EPA diagram where if you have a dry weather situation, the sewage just goes directly to the stormwater or the sewage treatment plant. But in wet weather, all of this surface water runoff also combines with the sewage, and it goes into our waterways and creates the image that you saw previous to this. So this first project I'm going to talk about is called the Sponge Park. And the idea is that we want to make more absorbent surfaces in like non-absorbent urban areas to absorb this water to keep it out of the combined sewers. The project is located in the GOWANUS section of Brooklyn. This is GOWANUS. My office is like right over here. And you can see that the area has transformed from a swamp in the 1700s to an industrial area by 1891, and then into a kind of quasi-post-industrial area by 2007. So the premise of this is that wetlands act like sponges, but I wasn't going to go into a community and say, I'm going to put a bunch of wetlands in your backyard. That just wasn't going to fly, right? So I had to come up with a euphemism for absorbent ground, for wetland, for swamp, right? And so we came up with the Sponge Park, and people get it, they love it. And because what you're doing is basically making this water or this surface more absorbent. So in general, the firm tackles a lot of these global issues with local pilots, and the Sponge Park is a really good example of that, because we started doing the initial planning working with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, which is a community group, a community environmental group, and we got a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts to do that initial planning. And then we applied for more grants working with the Gowanus Canal Dredgers and the Center for Urban Pedagogy, and we got a grant from the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission. That enabled us to do working drawings for a first pilot project. Then we applied for another grant from the Department of Environmental Conservation to develop a maintenance manual, because one of the issues that a lot of the city agencies have is how is this going to be maintained, and they want the community to be involved in the maintenance. Now along the way we managed to get city council support and get, I think, something like $700,000 in construction funding for the project. So we had drawings done with NWIPIC money, we had some money from City Council. It wasn't quite enough, so we applied for another grant from the Environmental Facilities Corporation and got another $500,000 to complete the project. And I say this to you because if you ever think it's not important to be a good writer as well as a good artist and a good designer, like, think again. It's really important to be able to communicate your ideas clearly in writing and in graphic form. And that's how we've raised millions of dollars to do our projects with grants, you know, and we've been able to facilitate a level of innovation that's impossible through normal public processes. So this is the site of the Gowanus. It's this degraded edge. There's an incredible amount of surface water runoff. There's nowhere for the water to go. And it ends up flowing down these street ends and brings with it all the oil and the detritus. And lest you think, I mean, this is kind of scary, but this is actually sewage sitting on the top of the Gowanus Canal. And then there's all this garbage. So this is New York City. This is not a third world country. And so we're really trying to solve this problem. We did a lot of work in section. Again, this is important for students. This enables you to sort of think about the sort of productive level of what you're doing without having to figure everything out all at once. But we added new programs. We were trying to create a continuous hydrologic system that sort of brought back some of the old swampland in a way, but it's an urban setting. So we're not going to just turn it all into parkland and make a new, bring back the swamp. We're going to make space that's usable. So this is an example of how we would do that with walkways over wetland areas that were cited below. So when we started doing this work, city planning was actually thinking about redeveloping the area for residential use. And one of the things the city was doing is creating a lot of waterfront esplanades. Our city planning commissioner was the planner for Battery Park City. You know, she had an idea of what waterfronts should look like, but there was this idea that there'd be an esplanade, and it would be either 20 feet or 40 feet. So we helped to sort of suggest that it really should be 40 feet, that we really needed to have that additional space to create more public amenity. But then what we noticed was that a lot of these buildings abut the canal and create blockages to the idea of a continuous esplanade. And it's kind of a, well, of course they do, because this is a place of industrial or a place of exchange, right? It was a place where you'd bring your boat in and you'd offload into a building that was right along the edge of the canal. So we thought, well, maybe we shouldn't think about creating a continuous esplanade. Maybe we should actually think about maintaining that industrial character and creating what we called an urban promenade and bring the pathways back into the community. And in that way, we're not just privileging the properties along the water's edge, we're redeveloping the whole community. We're adding value to the whole community. And we're providing environmental benefit because we're greening those streets and providing connectivity to some of the existing parkland. And our idea was to create an entire green district. So you can see this was adding, I think, 5.2 acres of permeable ground to the area. We calculated that we needed 11 acres to basically absorb all the surface water runoff in the area. And there are already some existing parks. So this would pretty much solve the stormwater issues in the area without having to build, you know, billion-dollar sewage treatment plants. So we started with a first pilot project, but just to explain sort of what it's like to work in New York City and how complicated it is, the GOWANUS is a navigable waterway. So it's controlled by the Army, or the water is controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. The sediment underneath the canal is also controlled by the Army Corps, but in the middle of our work, it was made an EPA Superfund, which added a whole nother level of approvals. The first 5 feet of soil in the upland area is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a state agency. The surface of the ground is owned by the Department of Transportation, which is a city agency. All the green is Parks Department, and they have to maintain that. The water that flows over the ground is the Department of Environmental Protection, which is a city agency. And then even the shade is controlled by a state agency, the shade over the water. There are 200 permits you have to get for any waterfront project, and it's phenomenal how long it can take and how complicated it is. But one of the things that was really important about this diagram is that it showed the agencies that we knew who owned what. So it reduced the amount of kind of churning that could exist where they're like, well, I don't know, like so-and-so is in charge of this, and say, no, you don't own that. DOT owns that, and you're in control of that, and you're in control of that. And so we were able to use this diagram to facilitate a faster decision-making process. It still took 8 years to get our first pilot done, but we're doing it. So part of the overall master planning involved cultural redevelopment. We're actually working for a private entity that bought this building and is turning it into an art center, which is exciting because it was part of our plan. But this pilot project that took 8 years to build is right at 2nd Street. And you know, you can basically calculate the amount of water that's flowing down the street, and then you can create a stormwater system to manage that. But you know, that's very sort of perfunctory and all that engineering. But what we wanted to do was make a new open space that could be part of this overall system. So this is the first piece. So, and these street ends could be replicated. The idea is that it's a pilot. So we worked within the 40-foot setback that the city had established. And this is the typical sort of street in Gowanus. And you know, you can see they're pretty degraded streets. But we had to submit our materials to another regulatory agency called the Public Design Commission. And the PDC is very sensitive about the use of materials and sort of the historic context. So what we wanted to show with this is that there are a lot of different materials. There are cobblestones that were put in at a certain point in time. The Gowanus Canal was built after the cobblestones were really prevalent in the US, so these would have been kind of reused. The road asphalt was invented in 1872, and then these green streets were put in. The park spaces, believe it or not, those are park spaces, were put in the 2000s. So what we wanted to show here is that there are a lot of different materials, and they're kind of all over the place. And this is our existing street, and so what we're saying to them is, that's the existing condition, we're just moving things around. We're not actually making a huge change in terms of the historic context because there really isn't a historic pattern. There are a lot of materials and we're just reorganizing them. So this is what our Sponge Park street end would look like, and this is kind of how it works. This one doesn't have sound. So this is the existing condition. These are these green streets that were put in by the Parks Department. So we're taking those out because they can only absorb the water that's falling into them. We're putting in new upland street swales, similar to the DEP standards. And then this is really important. We built the whole system out of precast concrete cells so that it could be replicated very easily, and then put in this integrated sidewalk and sedimentation basin. And there's also a pedestrian path over a sand filter, so that's kind of an extra level of protection. And then a drain that goes into the canal. So when it rains, basically the water's going to come down. Some of it's going to be captured by the upland bioswales, and then some of it's going to go into, or the rest of it goes into this bioretention basin, which distributes it into the planting beds. And then the plants are going to, be in the soil, and the plants are going to take up that water, evapotranspirate, use it to live. Then if we get a really big rain above the 1.2-inch rain, which is 90% of all storms in New York, then it'll go into the sand filter and then go into the canal. So this area is tidal. So the building of a modular construction or a system that can be installed in a modular way quickly was really important, and the use of precast concrete was also really important because you can't pour concrete when you have the tides going up. The contractors had to schedule around the various tidal calendars. But I like to joke that it took 8 years to get all the approvals and 8 weeks to build. So it was just like we had everything figured out, and it was kind of good because when we were doing it, the EPA Superfund people came out, the administrator, and he wanted to make changes. But we built it so quickly, which is great. It's like, sorry, Christos, we can't change that now, it's too late. And he said, you've gone too fast, sorry. Which is unheard of for a Department of Environmental Protection project. Their projects, they usually do $1 billion sewage treatment plants that take forever. But here you can see that the cells, they're big. It's kind of a big thing to do as a precast element, but here they are going into place, and this is it on October 21st, and then this was when the New York Times photographed us. The plants look kind of cruddy right now because it was put in kind of after the frost, but I think in the spring they'll come to life. It's going to take, with landscapes, it takes a little while for them to take off. There are 7,200 miles of bridges and elevated highways that run through U.S. cities, and I've been the Urban Design Fellow for the Design Trust for Open Space. And this is something that I was looking at for years before I became the Urban Design Fellow. And it's sort of a great marriage in a way, working with them, because we're looking at the 666 miles of elevated structures in New York. And we came up with a number of different site typologies: bridge, park, recharge, car, cluster, clover, and train, which are types which we felt could be enhanced with different sort of prototypical solutions. So we looked for distribution across the city, and then developed these typologies, really working with local community groups as well. we tried to consider, there's a whole book about it, but we considered aging infrastructure to help prioritize some of the work and when it could happen. One of the places that we looked at was the GOWANUS expressway, which is a very typical condition of a large expressway with a lot of space underneath that's currently used for parking. It's not the highest and best use of this space, in our opinion. So we thought, why don't we start to take it over and think about how we can manage some of the water coming off of the raised highway in like a pop-up green infrastructure system. And then maybe we can start to also have spaces underneath this highway where you can have maker space, where you can have artist studios, where you can do the stuff that's being displaced from some of the inner manufacturing districts. Like GOWANUS is now becoming much more residential. So the artists don't have anywhere where they can make a mess and make noise. And so we thought, you know, why not have a place where you can have saws and you know, do welding and that kind of thing. And then in the long term, maybe we turn this into art studios. We actually have something that can exist in that space and, you know, free of the columns, because the people who maintain these bridges want to be able to have access to the columns on the underside of the structure. But there's a lot of space there. And, you know, we should be using it because it's just too valuable to waste or to just give to parking. Then in another area, Broadway Junction has, it's a place where you have subways and cars and trains all coming together, and it's incredibly hard to sort of figure out where you are. So we want to try to reclaim that public space with wayfinding and planting and seeding and make it into something that sort of celebrates the infrastructure rather than just sort of manages it. Another area that I was working on before I became the Design Trust Fellow is up in the Bronx, dealing with the water that's coming off of the highways. And you can see this is a big problem. This is not a lake, this is just a big puddle. And there's nowhere for this water to go. And it's dangerous because this water has a lot of, you know, pigeon feces. It's just, it's toxic in a lot of ways. So what we did with some grants, we got a grant from NOAA and a grant from the Department of Environmental Protection to develop some prototypes of how to manage this water and create new kinds of garden spaces. So these are two of those. One is a system that is in-ground made out of precast concrete, and the other is made out of gabions. So here you can see we basically just took the section of pipe off. It was just allowing the water to go out onto the street. So we took that off and we put on our own new pipe, which actually was really, that's probably the biggest challenge, having the state DOT let us touch their pipes. But we built this in a public park, and you can see again there's like the sedimentation basin over here, and then this is it in construction. And then this is the one with the gabions. Now, one of the issues that happens when you create wildlife in the city is that you create wildlife in the city, or you make a house for wildlife in the city, and we've created the perfect habitat for this muskrat. And apparently, like we're monitoring all of our projects to see how much water is coming in, how much water is going out, what the water quality is going in and out of the system. And we have these vaults with the monitoring equipment. And the angle at the bottom of the vault, it's, you know, there's a slight angle so that it will drain, was the exact angle of a muskrat lair. Like the things you wouldn't think to research as you're designing your green infrastructure. But anyway, so this muskrat moved in and was like, hey, they built me a condo, this is really nice, and it's really great here, but he was like chewing up our monitoring equipment and leaving candy bar wrappers and just all this crap in the vault. So we didn't introduce bobcats. We actually came up with some other design solutions. He's just there for scale, but you know, you never know. So there are 35 million US residents who live within 100 meters of a 4-lane highway. And I would say for the last decade, I've been working on another muse, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. This is actually fairly close to my office. This is Carroll Gardens and Cobble Hill. So I had a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts and created this vision for that section of the BQE which then got the attention of a city councilwoman who hired me for some of this additional work. But one of the things that I found really important early on was to attach design to economics. And we used U.S. Forest Service data to create this diagram that suggested that 350 trees would generate a $50 million gain over 10 years. So this is the power of graphics, of design, because, or it shows the power of communication through design. Because this Forest Service document was just this really boring tome. You know, it was a lot of words. And we turned it into this one-page diagram. So we can substantiate everything we did by going back and referencing that document. But the suggestion that we're creating all this pollution control and oxygen generation and shade value is incredibly powerful and can be used as a political tool. So, and you know, who was the master of politics more than Robert Moses, who created the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway in the first place. Moses did a lot of great things in New York. He created a lot of parks and playgrounds and open spaces and parkways in order to get people out of the city and out to the country and the beaches. But unfortunately, he also did this. He created landscapes like the Cross Bronx Expressway and the BQE, which really did a lot of harm to communities. I would say he did kind of a bait. He proposed these beautiful parkways. And I just want to read this. And he, Robert Moses, spent a lot of time looking down at it, watching the cranes and derricks and earth-moving machines that looked like toys far below him, moving about in the giant trench being cut through mile after mile of densely packed houses, a big black figure against the sunset in the late afternoon, like a giant gazing down at the giant road he was molding. This is from The Power Broker by Robert Caro, which you should all read if you want to be students of infrastructure. But he had an apartment in the Bossert Hotel, which actually looked down at this from Brooklyn Heights. And so these are the actual derricks cutting through this brownstone neighborhood. So all of these brownstones were just eliminated to make this big road. So I've been working in a couple of areas. I mentioned that that I started looking at the BQE down in Carroll Gardens, but then Councilwoman Reyna saw that work and brought me in to work in her neighborhood, which is Lasouris, which has a much lower income and a much higher population. So it's actually a much less expensive project. I feel like it's like something that just has to happen. So I've been helping her politically for the last decade on this one as well. But the BQE creates a lot of physical boundaries, which you can see in both cases. But the section that we're focusing on was built in 1950, and that's important to remember. It's a territory that creates, or it's an area that creates territorial boundaries with the Dominican gangs on one side and the Puerto Rican gangs on the other, and the highway actually creates the site of conflict. So we want to think about that. We looked at public health issues in relation to the BQE trench, physical activity levels, and neighborhood poverty. All of these data sets were used to make an argument that this park space should go in. And then we also looked at the amount of open space. There is some space along the trench that is used for tot lots, but there isn't a lot of active recreation space. There's no space for teenagers to go run around. And that's a problem given the high incidence of gang violence in the area. So through a lot of community meetings, this sort of traditional one, and also going out into the playgrounds, into the churches, we worked with the community, and what they said was, we really want to have play space. We want to have playing fields on top of this trench. And so we came up with this plan that has a baseball field and then a flexible playing field over the trench area. And that's actually really important because we worked with Weidlinger Engineering to figure out the feasibility of actually capping the trench. And what we found was that there were certain areas where it actually made sense because we could touch down in the center. We have to keep the deck fairly thin because we have to bring the road up to new federal highway standards. So that means we need 16 feet of clearance. And because we have to keep the deck fairly thin, that means that we can't put a lot of weight on it. So if you notice in these drawings, we have a lot of trees on the side, but not in the middle. So in our plan, our idea is that we have field turf, artificial turf over the center for the playing fields, and then we do real plants over on the side that can be more verdant and green. So the other issue we were thinking about is the age of these bridges. This highway was built in 1950, and these bridges are really at the end of their lifespan. They cost about $10 million each to replace. So we thought, why don't we leverage that against a federal, state, or private grant to basically make this park happen. So the expenditure of the $30 million has to be made by the city. So, that's already like in the budget, right? And so why not actually use that to create something so much more important and meaningful for this community, to turn this passive open space into something that's much more active and meaningful to people. So over the last couple of years, I've been working with the Trust for Public Land on a project called the Queensway. There are 20,000 miles of rail trails in the United States, and the Queensway is adding another 3.5 miles. The Queensway runs through center of Queens. It's 3.5 miles long, 47 acres of new park space for New York City, which is pretty good. And 40 of those acres are currently DCAS property, which is not really owned by any agency. It's kind of in limbo. And then 7 belongs to the New York City Parks Department. So this is the existing condition, but it also is incredibly beautiful. Believe it or not, this is New York City, and this is the middle of Queens. And this could be Vermont. It's so pretty. So there are a number of sort of distinct places that exist along the line, even though it's a long linear landscape. It varies a lot. So we have the Clearing, North Passage, Metropolitan Hub, Forest Park Grove, South Passage, and Elevated. And we didn't just divide this up as a phasing strategy. It kind of had a lot to do with the character of the places and the neighboring communities. It also had to do with the diversity of the communities. CB9 and CB10 are the most diverse in the city. And there are 322,000 people who live within a 20-minute walk. So that's actually not that dense for New York City, but it's a lot of people. So we worked on sort of enhancing the programs in different areas and we had a lot of community meetings trying to figure out what people wanted and what would be most viable for each particular area. And one of the things that's really interesting about it is that, it was a train line. So trains have to stay, in spite of what Bjarke Ingels thinks about trains going up and down, they don't go up and down, they go flat. And they have to stay flat. So, unless you're in an animated cartoon. So because they have to stay flat, the upper part is on a bit of an embankment, and the center part is in what looks like a ravine, and then the bottom part is on a structure that looks kind of like the High Line. So the reason for that is that the center is actually in this area that is cutting through the Wisconsin Glacier. So there was this terminal moraine from the Wisconsin Glacier. So it's not actually going through a ravine, it's actually cutting through a big pile of gravel and rock and smaller stone. But you can see how, these two drawings don't actually look that different. This is a very sort of soft approach to the transformation of this landscape. We're cleaning it up, we're adding new trails, we're improving the ecology. It's a real park, it's a practical park. It can't be the High Line. It's not like the middle of Chelsea. This is like a working class neighborhood. This is actually one of the poorer areas of New York City. So we're trying to do things that are really strategic so that it can become a great public park for people that live there. So this is the northern section, which is actually in Forest Hills. That vehicle isn't doing anything there, it was just left there. I don't know why, but so we want to transform this space. We wanted to make it a productive landscape and a beautiful landscape and a useful landscape. So there are new pathways and play areas, but and this is actually a whole stormwater management system for the whole area. The stone, I mentioned that we cut through the Wisconsin glacier. One of the themes that we're developing throughout the entire Queensway is the use of these stones, because in the northern part of the site, the stones were used as boundaries for the old Dutch farms. So we're drawing upon that cultural reference and then also drawing upon the geologic reference, trying to really give meaning to this place. When you have a site that's been left alone for 60 years, you end up with a lot of really big, beautiful trees. And so we're capitalizing on that neglect. You can't buy time in that way. So what we're doing is clearing out all the poison ivy and the Japanese knotweed and creating this new seating area so that you can watch your kids play ball. The playing fields exist. And so we're trying to take advantage of that and make new spaces adjacent. So there are a number of houses that exist along the edge of the Queensway, and the people who live there are very sensitive to building a path in their backyard. And so what we did was we tried to really shape this landscape to create more of a buffer and help with erosion issues, but also make it so that you didn't feel really isolated when you're on the path, keep it visible enough. We also looked at year-round uses of the park and trying to improve the access. There's an active recreation area, like playing fields up here, so we have a new ramp going down. And then we added new understory plantings with the evergreens and the dogwoods to really create some winter interest. Then we're also looking for educational opportunities along the trail. There's a school called the Metropolitan Expeditionary Learning Academy that exists right next to the Queensway. And so we're going to build these new learning environments and work with the teachers to develop curriculum related to the park, but then also get their input on what they think should be in the park, which is really kind of fun. So we're talking to them about their lesson plans and what kinds of things they teach, so that we can really have a very kind of strong relationship with the school. And I mean, ultimately what we're trying to do is make an urban greenway for real New Yorkers. This is the southern section. You can see it's simple, but we're maintaining the old tracks in some way, but in a very sort of quiet way. So 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of a coast. And we have a global problem of sort of increased severity of storms. The white lines on this map actually represent hurricanes. In 2010, we partnered with Architecture Research Office on a project called MoMA Rising Currents. There were 5 teams that were looking at how to protect New York City from a big storm. And what we were doing is looking at all these green areas are places that would be inundated by a Category 2 storm. So we were trying to really transform that landscape. If you look at the transformation of the New York landscape over time, it's pretty interesting. What we've done is successively kind of fill out, because when ships would come to New York historically, they would have to dock out here, because this is all shallow ground or shallow waters. So they would dock out here, and then you'd have to offload into smaller boats in order to get to the shore. That's not very practical for shipping. So what we did over time was fill out and dig channels and create these slips in order to facilitate that exchange. And then in 1960, as the boats got bigger, we started to build these finger piers out into the harbor so that bigger ships could come in and offload. But then with containerized shipping, all the shipping moved away from the waterfront. And so by 2010, we ended up with a waterfront where the highest and best use was recreation and residential use. And I would say that that still is the case, although I think there's some people are thinking slightly differently about it just because of Sandy, hopefully. So if you look at the hydrology of 1845, it's interesting because this green line actually looks very much like the 1645 water line. And what I want you to note is that a lot of these hydrologic systems existed then, have been encapsulated, but want to come back. So we mapped the value at risk for 2100. We mapped the 6-foot sea level rise that was projected. Everybody in our group used a 6-foot sea level rise, which assumes rapid ice cap melt, and then an 18-foot Category 2 storm surge. This is the existing seawall in 2010. This is it in 2100 with 6 feet of sea level rise, and this is with a Category 2 storm inundation. And these are existing combined sewer overflow locations, so just like GOWANUS. So our notion was water is going to come in, and we want to get it out. So how do we create a system to do that? And our idea, or our concept, was to create a new urban ground. So we created these level 1 streets for absorption. 27% of New York City is paved with streets. And so we thought, you know what, there's an opportunity there. What if we made them all permeable? So I moved all the infrastructure, you know, all the gas lines and water lines and fiber optic lines. I moved those all into waterproof vaults underneath the sidewalks with hatches so that you could get in if they ever broke or became obsolescent. And then we had these level 2 streets for distribution and collection. So here we have the absorptive streets in the same system as before, but we had an additional layer of conveyance of additional water. And then these level 3 streets for protection. So the thought with this was if you had a big storm surge, all that salt water could come in and be retained underneath the roads, in certain roads, and then go out when the tide went out. And this was the whole idea about a porous green street system. So that's just the streets. And then we needed a 6-foot hardened edge. So we're going to raise the level of the grade by 6 feet, and then create new waterfront parks that could absorb the surface water runoff, like on a normal basis, and then freshwater wetlands that could absorb that water as well, and then salt marshes to help to dissipate the force of storm surges to create an entire resilient system. So just to give you an idea what that would look like, along the Hudson River estuary, we created a new kind of crenellated pattern, urban design pattern. We cut into Battery Park City. We knocked down a whole bunch of buildings because you can do that with museum exhibition. And we created these zones that were these new kinds of landscapes, these protective landscapes that also provided access for small boats to go in between the buildings. The water is sort of threading into the urban fabric, and here you can see how that looks. And then down along the end of Manhattan, we had the Battery Breakwater. Again, this is a place where you could have small craft, and these would develop over time. We drew it as a geometric pattern. They were geotextile sacks that would be planted. These are actually existing in the shallows, so they wouldn't just wash away. But we did maintain areas for channels for ferries and boats to get in. And then over along the east side, we created the East River esker and breakwater. The thought here was that we'd create an esker as a geologic formation. Again, it's a sort of snake-like berm that would exist all along the east side to protect the resources there. And then outbound of that, we'd have these new wetland areas with walkways out over them. And then also, in the historic slips, we'd have what we call these sponge slips. So these were places that, again, could take a lot of water if there was a really big flood. But they can handle, the plants are designed, or plants were specified that could handle periodic inundation of salt water. And this creates an entire resilient city. We calculated how much water was coming in and sort of figured it all out. And we worked hard to get the city to start to make changes. And the city was slowly starting to adopt at least some of the edge strategies when we had this big storm called Sandy. It was really interesting because this is where the water went. It basically went to that 1625 water line, and it went back to that 1845 hydrologic map of DLand, and turned the lights out because the infrastructure wasn't protected in waterproof vaults. And it caused, I think, something like upwards of $50 billion worth of economic loss for the city. So after, there were a lot of proposals to put in gigantic gates to keep the water out. And this is what they look like. And these hard infrastructure systems are massive, and they work until they don't. And I think that's one of the things I've been thinking a lot about with a lot of these huge water impoundment systems, because unfortunately, they have a limit. So I thought, why don't we create hybrid systems that actually are working with natural and constructed systems? So use the strength of the engineering, but then have something that will grow and adapt over time. So that's sort of one layer of thinking, like, okay, let's adapt. And then my other thought was, maybe we should just move. So, and I started thinking about the economics of it, of being on the water's edge, and the economics of just being in New York City in general. What this map shows is the property values in New York City, and the red is high, and the blue is low. And ironically, this blue is actually high ground, so there's where you should buy real estate. Right? Be really valuable in 50 years. But my thought was to create something I called zone air. So transfer development rights away from the water to valuable areas in order to provide a fund to not only relocate people away from those waterfront areas, but also to pay to create these new protective landscapes. Because one of the big hurdles that we face in creating these landscapes is they're really expensive and they have to be maintained. And they're kind of experimental also. So, it's going to take a while before we can actually make this start to happen. But I think something needs to happen. And so, we're working on a lot of projects that I think are sort of inching away at getting us closer to the development of those edge landscapes. And this project is one of them, the Marshes project in Staten Island. And it's the first wetland mitigation bank in New York State. And you probably do this here, like all over the place. I don't know. But it happens in a lot of other places in the United States, but it's not happening in New York yet, so this is the first one. But what we're doing is we're restoring this landscape that has been really degraded and turning it back into a wetland. And what it is, it's a financial instrument where developers in other places can buy credits in this landscape. So in a way, it's kind of like my zone air project, where it's a transfer of sort of value from one place to another. So we're also working on the New York Rising project, which is the state effort to rebuild post-Sandy and reshaping some of these edge landscapes, creating wet meadows, and really also reshaping the bathymetry of the surrounding waterways in order to have more capacity and more to absorb that water, and also to protect, to slow the waves. But as I showed in that first map, it's a global problem. And so after Sandy, we also started developing some more theoretical work about different landscapes around the world, from reef ecologies that could be protective, reef ecologies, mangrove ecologies, maritime forest ecologies, and then thinking about how those ecologies apply to different economies from, this is actually the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. This is Shanghai, the financial economy, the tourist economy of Miami Beach, and then also informal economies of Bangladesh. And just in looking a little bit more detail at the tourist economy in Miami, thinking about how we could reshape that landscape, making a dunescape, replanting the mangroves, and actually probably building kind of a berm wall to protect the upland areas. Miami has a lot of issues, though. Anyway, that I don't have time to go into on this. And then also looking at the other economy is the agricultural economy of the Nile River Delta, which is actually quite terrifying in relation to a lot of the migrations we've been seeing, because about a third of this area, which is the breadbasket for the entire region, is going to be inundated with salt water. So there has to be a transformation of how agriculture is happening, or somehow there has to be more of an import-export economy to feed these populations, and there needs to be a greater awareness of these kinds of massive ecological changes that are going to affect people all over the world. So there are 39 million, I'm getting close to the end, there are 39 million acres of roads and parking lots in the US. So to give you an idea of scale, that's Georgia, and it's almost Florida, just paved. So.
Put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? The gay paradise, put up a parking lot.
That was to wake you up after all that talk about climate change. So we're unpaving parking lots. So in St. Louis, we're working on a project called the Public Media Commons. And it's in an area that is filled with parking. And what we're doing is creating a new open space that is the first, well, it's really the first open space on this really important art walk. There are some really important buildings that are designed by Ondo and by Brad Clopefill, and then there's some historic buildings, beautiful architecture. But now we're starting to transform this landscape with this new open space. This is the existing condition. It was a parking lot, but luckily the people from the public radio and the public television stations had enough vision to think about taking away that parking and turning it into a new open space. And so what we've created is really a place that can celebrate media. This is the public television, this is the public radio, this is actually a brand new building. And then over here is the Sheldon, which is a performance space. And what we've made is a place that has, it's basically like a big open area that has digital media built into these facades. These are huge screens that broadcast the media coming out of the public television station. So sometimes you have like Big Bird up there, it's really fun. And then there's also these are individual television screens where you can walk over and there's one of the little things that hooks in with your I'm such a Luddite. The things that you can hook in with your phone, and then you can have your own sort of personal one-on-one video experience. But it's an incredibly well-used space. It's used for St. Louis Fashion Week, and the other aspect of it is that we really tried to augment or consider the indigenous landscape and do that while also thinking about a play on media and the sort of RGB planting. So you can start to see that a little bit with some of the yellows and the reds in this kind of lush grassy landscape. There's a bit of an amphitheater area for performance or for sitting and watching performances. It was really just built last year. Images, and it's used all the time, and it's used at night, and it has just completely revitalized this area, and it was so well received that we're now actually doing another piece of the art walk over here by the Sheldon, and we applied for a grant with the Sheldon people to redo their parking lot and turn their parking lot into something really exciting. So I think we got something like $600,000 to make a really beautiful parking lot. So, it's good. It's all good. because if you're going to do one, you might as well make it great and make it absorb water and turn it into something that can be an amenity. So this is the last project I'm going to talk about, and it says, will alternate forms of food production change our views of farming? We worked with Jim Bieber's office to develop a vertical farm for the American Pavilion for the Milan Expo. And so going back to the Jeffersonian grid, you know, we had the grid of the big steel frame that he had designed for the building, and he called me and he said, can you just design a vertical farm? And I thought, well, that's kind of stupid. I don't think it'll work. And, you know, but then we talked for about an hour, and I just seen this lecture by Wendell Berry, and I thought, you know what, this is a challenge. I think we really need to do this. But we worked with the James Beard Foundation as well. They were one of the partners in the project. So it was about sort of sustainability. It was also about food and taste and diet, and you know, it had to be very nationalistic because it was the American Pavilion, and the State Department was sponsoring it. And so we looked at this grid and how kind of regularized that was, and thought, but there are all these geographies that really reflect the true flavor of the American landscape, and then they also affect the flavor of the food that's coming out of the American landscape. And so why don't we create a system that really talks about some of these new ideas about smaller scale farming and different kinds of food production. And we built this vertical wall for this pavilion. Michael Beirut designed from Pentagram, designed the logo for the American flag. But it was this amazingly productive landscape. We had 50 different crops. We used a lot of heritage seeds, but it produced 6,000 pounds of food per week. We used something called a zip grow tower, which is actually an agricultural product that was designed by an agronomist out of the University of Wyoming. So it's kind of remarkable, but it's also really quite beautiful. So we designed these frames out of steel, and then we integrated the irrigation into the hydroponic system. And the water goes down each of these towers. And these things just pull out, and there's a little irrigation tube. It's pretty, like, simple, but it was really complicated to make it look this elegant. But it was incredibly productive and so just beautiful to see. I have to say, I was so excited. There were like strawberries hanging off of here and peppers, and the kohlrabi looked really strange because it was sort of sitting out. And you sort of wonder how these plants can actually survive in this weird vertical setting, but it actually worked. And this is actually Nate. And when I visited him out in, I think it was Aurora, Colorado, at one of the farms that was run by this guy, Hayden Christensen, who was this farm kid, he told this story about how, there are a lot of kids that want to keep farming, that have grown, they're like the 13th kid, and the section of land that was bought by the ancestors in the 1850s or earlier has gotten chopped up, either because of real estate development pressures or because you have big families and they divide up the land into smaller portions. So by the time Hayden Christensen came around, there wasn't a lot of land left for him to keep farming. So he introduced me to Hayden, and Hayden had this little greenhouse. And it was not very big, but it had a bunch of these zip towers. This is actually Nate in the greenhouse. I'm sorry the picture's so bad. But it was amazing to see these plants growing on these towers. This is kale. But he had them in these boxes. And what he told me was that 60% of the cost for a small farmer is in packaging. So Hayden was able to actually make a really good living because he would take the towers off and he'd put them on these bases and he'd bring them to the Whole Foods. And people would cut the vegetables directly off of the towers. So there was no packaging. So it was just pure, like, he made so much more money. and was able to develop or to deliver, the freshest quality or high quality products. So I thought that was really interesting. And, Nate ended up becoming a partner in the project and working on the design, which is really incredibly helpful because, no matter, it's complicated doing these farming systems, and no matter how complicated it got, he would be like, you betcha, sure, yeah, of course, but he would go in and figure it out because he actually came from a farm family as well. And he was somebody that was doing a lot of phytoremediation work, and then he got sick of writing grant proposals, so that's why he did this. So anyway, but he told one final story, which is my final story to communicate to you, because he said one of his big clients was this guy who owned all these bars down in Miami, and apparently he had a need for mint, and needed thousands and thousands of pounds of mint every week for mojitos. And so he's growing them in these greenhouses. So basically Nate's business in Wyoming is following the markets to Miami. So with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.